But if you put Russia and Iran and North Korea together, you've got effectively three pariah states. And India is playing a very clever game. India is certainly not helping the Russian war effort, and India doesn't want to queer its pitch with the rest of the world any more than China does. Of course, China in the relationship with Russia, China is definitely the senior partner, although Mr. Putin hates to hear that. And China certainly doesn't want to be seen to be helping Russia to the extent where it might lose its Western markets. So individually, the countries, they may go along to this summit and give Mr. Putin a little bit of credence in one sense, but the amount of help they're actually giving to the war effort is really limited to Iran, and North Korea is not there anyway.
President Putin has welcomed the leaders of China, India and Turkey to an international summit intended to signal that Western attempts to isolate Russia have failed. It's a gathering of the so-called BRICS nations, which initially brought together Brazil, Russia, India and China, but now involves South Africa and other countries. And it's the biggest gathering of world leaders in Russia since it invaded Ukraine more than 2 years ago. President Putin denied the gathering was a gesture of defiance to the West.
BRICS was never built against anyone. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi said a very good phrase. He said recently that BRICS is not anti-Western, it's just non-Western.
Well, that was a translation, obviously, of President Putin speaking earlier. Stephen Dalziel is a former senior Russian affairs analyst at the BBC World Service. Hello, Stephen.
Good evening, Carol. Good to see you again.
Well, good to speak to you. And we've got these pictures that we've all been able to see of President Putin shaking hands with President Xi and so on. How significant do you think this gathering is?
Well, let me quote the man who came up with the acronym originally, Jim O'Neill, the former chairman of Goldman Sachs, now Lord O'Neill. He was the one who came up with this acronym, BRIC, BRIC, around about the turn of the century. It's got an S added because South Africa had joined, but that stood for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And Jim O'Neill in the last 2 days has said, BRICS don't matter. He said it really doesn't. So, Mr. Putin is trying to create this idea that he's very important, and Russia still has a lot of friends around the world. But if you think that there are officially 10 members now of BRICS, it's interesting that the Russians took the acronym BRICS. The first four, BRIC, it would have worked in Russian, but South Africa doesn't begin with an S in Russian, it begins with a U. But anyway, so you had the five. They've now been added to with Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Now, it's a pretty mixed bag. As you mentioned in your introduction, Turkey, President Erdogan is there as well. But that's, I think, because he likes to cause trouble or just be seen to be alongside other dictators such as Putin. But he's not actually a member of BRICS. So it's a peculiar organization. Its members account for 45% of the world population, although between them they account for 28% of the world economy. And the idea is it's meant to be an alternative to challenge the G7. Of course, they're the seven most advanced industrialized nations in the world. But if we go back to Jim O'Neill, I think he thinks it's not really much of a challenger.
But what is significant, isn't it, is that Russia has these pretty big allies who are still prepared to deal with him, to talk to him. And of course, they're helping his war effort. I mean, we know that Iranian drones have been used against Ukraine. Of course, we've recently seen the evidence of the involvement of North Korea, but China is also thought to be providing military equipment. And it is President Putin, isn't it, saying, well, look, okay, if the United States and Europe are going to broadly isolate me, that's not going to work because I've got these other huge, powerful nations that are still prepared to do deals.
Well, the ones who are prepared to do deals over the war, as you really mentioned, I mean, North Korea has been sending weaponry and we now believe could be about to send up to 10,000 troops to the front line in Ukraine. Iran, of course, almost from the beginning of the war, has been sending drones in particular. The Chinese, whether they're sending weaponry, it's not. We don't know for sure. The Chinese are largely sitting on the fence as far as the war in Ukraine goes. But if you put Russia and Iran and North Korea together, you've got effectively three pariah states. And India is playing a very clever game. India is certainly not helping the Russian war effort, and India doesn't want to queer its pitch with the rest of the world any more than China does. Of course, China in the relationship with Russia, China is definitely the senior partner, although Mr. Putin hates to hear that. And China certainly doesn't want to be seen to be helping Russia to the extent where it might lose its Western markets. So individually, the countries, they may go along to this summit and give Mr. Putin a little bit of credence in one sense, but the amount of help they're actually giving to the war effort is really limited to Iran, and North Korea is not there anyway.
But it does it not, allow President Putin to build better trading links? Because we've got the US and the EU imposing all these sanctions. It certainly does seem, when you look at the Russian economy, is that they're finding other ways to get hold of most of the essential goods that they need in the country, even if they're not directly providing military supplies for the war in Ukraine. They do seem to be helping the Russians to get round those sanctions.
To a certain extent, Carol, you're right. But again, if we look down the list of the 10 countries, the amount of trade in global terms is still pretty small. India is significant here because India has been buying a lot more Russian oil and gas. So they are getting significant sums of money from India. But the idea, one of the ideas that Putin really pushes behind the BRICS countries is that they together would work out a way where they could deal not in dollars. That's much of the world economy is still based on the US dollar, and the BRICS countries are not going to change that. So there, that's a bit of a fig leaf. And if you look behind it, you find that actually that's something that's not going to work, and the rest of the world is still going to be dealing mainly in dollars.
Jeff's got in touch, and he says several of our long-standing allies are at this meeting. I'm assuming that he's talking about countries like India, who is a long-standing ally, Turkey, with whom we do at least we work alongside them in NATO and so on. He says, if you don't think that's a cause for concern, Stephen, not quite sure what sort of diplomacy you're studying. I mean, this will be a matter of concern, won't it, to countries that are trying to economically as well as diplomatically isolate Russia. If you've got big, important economies and countries like India, like Turkey, as well as, of course, China with its huge spending power, that are there and doing deals with Putin. Brazil, well, at one stage, we seem to be wanting to extend our trade ties with Brazil.
Yeah, I can see his point, but I would still say that to me, far more important is the wider economy, the dollar-based economy. And it's the fact that India and China don't want to upset the West too much. And Turkey, yes, Turkey is there. How much trade Turkey will actually be doing as a result of this, I'm very skeptical, I must admit. So, Saudi Arabia is there as well, but Saudi Arabia is not going to stop selling oil to the West. We're its better customer.
Symbolism is always very important, isn't it, to President Putin? And he'll love to be there rubbing shoulders with other world leaders, won't he? And waste no opportunity to put those pictures out.
You're absolutely right. And in that sense, I think it's the domestic audience that are the real target here. He can go on Russian TV, as no doubt he has been today and will be for the next few days, and, showing his people, look how important I am. It's very interesting to take one Western example of a newspaper I greatly respect from abroad. I won't say anything from this country. From the Washington Post, for example, they've been saying absolutely nothing about this meeting. And the Washington Post are normally, yes, there's a lot of coverage of the forthcoming US election. But if the Washington Post don't think it's that important to say much about this at this stage, I think that's an indication that the West is really not too worried. The other thing is, of course, rather like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting last week that took place in Pakistan, that's another organization that the Russians and others are trying to show as an alternative to the West. But you've got these countries in it, like Russia and China, which are dictatorships who are not used to doing things democratically, discussing things with the other people at the meeting and coming to a conclusion as a result of that. These are countries that are used to telling people what they want and expecting to get it. So these are not really democratic organizations, either the SCO or BRICS. And I think that is a major failing when it comes to any chance to really to change things and to stand up as a genuine alternative to Western organizations.
Just let me ask you about one other story that's just broken in the last few minutes. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, saying Russia risks global food security in Ukraine. Keir Starmer, who's heading off to that big Commonwealth summit, saying that Russia has stepped up attacks on Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea, delaying the export of agricultural produce, including aid intended for Palestinians, although, of course, getting them aid through to them is another whole factor. But we're hearing that during several days of strikes in the last week or so, Russian weapons have hit at least 4 cargo ships, including one carrying 6,000 tons of corn. Do you see this as a new tactic, at least, in the war, Stephen?
It sounds like a renewed tactic because, of course, it's something they were doing fairly early on. Ukraine has been incredibly successful in effectively beating the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Navy. They've pushed them back to ports in Russia because the sea drones and other attacks from Ukraine have sunk a number of their vessels. But that is particularly worrying. If we remember back in the early days of the war, indeed the first few months, there was a lot of negotiation to allow Ukrainian grain to be exported. And with the lesser influence of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, that's been far more successful in recent months. If the Russians are now stepping up attacks on what is civilian shipping, then that is very worrying. It's as if they've gone back to that attempt to create a world food crisis because a lot of countries and in the global south are dependent on Ukrainian grain. That is a way of taking the fight to another level, and that we must watch what happens. But if that is continuing over the next days and weeks, that is very worrying.
Stephen Dalziel, former senior Russian affairs analyst at the BBC World Service. Really good to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen.